One of my previous speakers mentioned that it's a good thing that open source people don't have lots of long hair anymore. I think I'm a good example for that. Actually, right now I have a role on the business side, but I do come from the open source side, and I still contribute to open source. So I've been a FreeBSD contributor for more than 10 years. I work with the GNU compiler, for example, and several other projects. Now, talking about hair, do you know this guy, this person? So this is Richard Stallman. He did not create open source. He created something called free software. And in 1983, he created the GNU project. And the GNU project started with the goal to create a free operating system, an entire operating system. And to a large extent, Richard and many others have succeeded, because we are using a free operating system today, or there are several, but the most prominent one is actually Linux. Not GNU, unfortunately. And what Richard really kicked off is not just the software, so not just writing software and giving the software away for free, but creating an infrastructure, creating a framework on how to do this. And an important aspect there is the concept of license. Classic software, proprietary software is licensed, so you have to pay for the right to use the software. And what Richard does, and what we do, and many other open software vendors do, is actually a different model. It's a model that's about sharing, it's a model that's about working together, about freely using things. And the key concept behind that is the concept of copyleft. And copyleft basically gives you, as a user of the software, many rights. It also gives you, if you distribute the software, some obligations. Which means if you use my software and you give it to someone else, you can do this, but you also have to give him the source code. So, and the purpose behind that is to keep free software free. 1991, and that's another key person. This more around open source. This is Linus Torvalds. The Linux was created, so more than 20 years ago. That's a picture of Linux with a bit more hair. Right now he has a bit less hair than that. And the difference that we have seen between Richard Stallman and Linus and what came after Linus is a difference more between, if you want, theory, dogma, being dogmatic, and being very pragmatic about use of software, use of legal frameworks, etc. 1996 is an interesting year. That's the logo of Apache. In 1996, a free software web server became the most widely used web server on the planet. And Apache has held that role ever since. And that's really interesting to see. The word open source, the term open source, is a lot newer. So we have the GNU project, we have the Linux kernel, we have Apache and many other projects. But the concept called open source only dates back to 1998. And around that time frame, things started to move very quickly. Around that time frame, many companies, commercial companies, really historically big into proprietary software, changed and it started to adopt open source. SAP was one of the first ones. In 1999, they started to port and provide SAP on Linux. They're actually developing on SUSE. That's why I know those details. And even on the mainframe, classic, old, if you want, old, big, conservative computers, in the year 2000, IBM and SUSE actually started to provide Linux for mainframes. And Linux is one of the reasons why mainframes are still so successful in the market. Mainframes aren't growing but it's very clear that without Linux, mainframes would not exist to the extent they do anymore. So the year 2000 was when Enterprise Linux was created, when we at SUSE had the first Enterprise Linux version, and in 2001 we then interestingly moved from the mainframe to regular PC hardware, and that was SUSE Linux Enterprise Server. What followed in about the 10 years after is that the question changed. And here are a couple of proof points. The question that people are asking them, or should be asking them, is not, should we use open source? Is open source good enough? Is it safe enough? The question is, how can I use open source? Where does it fit? Where maybe it doesn't fit yet for my purposes. And I'll give you some examples to show just where, and this is all about Linux, the next couple of pictures, where Linux is being used. One example is here. Let's talk about scaling up, so really big systems. That's something that we did with NASA around 2005, 2006 already, where they had 20 machines running Linux. And that doesn't sound much, 20 servers, right? Well, the point is, what you see here, these two racks, that's just one of them. So they had 20 servers, and each of those 20 servers had 512 sockets. And that was some engineering work, but Linux just works with that very, very fine. So really big systems. This is a system in Munich, Germany, that became the fastest supercomputer in Europe last year. And that's scaling out. So this is not few big systems, this is hundreds, this is thousands of small systems, clusters, and again, Linux is just working fine for that kind of environment. Or to give you another example, this is a TV show in the United States, it's called Jeopardy. Vladimir, my colleague here, told me you have similar shows here in Russia. And 2 years ago, a computer called Watson actually won against two human players. And the system was running IBM Power hardware, which is why IBM did not actually communicate that the system was actually running Linux. We put this on our homepage and said IBM Watson was running SUSE Linux. And what happened is that our CEO then got the call from a very high manager at IBM who said, well, you know, this has been Power hardware. We really prefer to say this was, we really prefer to sell it with AIX, our Unix. Can you please adjust your homepage and don't mention that Linux was that? Yeah, and another example that affected me personally is use of Linux in mission-critical environments. So yesterday, I flew into Nümpelhof from Nuremberg, so this is a picture of the Nuremberg airport. And German air traffic control and other air traffic controls are actually using open source for the mission-critical systems, not for payroll or something like that, really for the systems connected to the radar screens where the operators are working on. So when I flew to Moscow yesterday, my life depended on open source, in fact on SUSE engineers to make sure the whole system works nicely. Now that's only airspace, and I know today is actually an important day here in Russia. I think Mr. Gagarin didn't have open source back then when he went to space, but perhaps there are some interesting use cases to use open source going forward as you do new space explorations. And last but not least, Linux is used in many cases, or open source is used in many cases where you don't even know it, or you may not know it. This is one example. This is my cell phone and it runs Linux. Or when you go to a hospital, and this is an area where I know that because it's an area where SUSE has some focus on. But when you go to a hospital and you do some computer scans, in many cases there is some Linux operating those devices. Or when you have an electronic scalpel, in many cases there's Linux. Or telephone systems, the bigger ones. In many cases there is Linux. So probably many of you, if not all of you, are using Linux or are using open source today already without even realizing that's the case. And the market is proving this. This is some data from IDC. So that's one of those analyst houses that studies the market. And what they find is, of all operating systems in the server market, there are only two operating systems which are growing. One is Microsoft Windows, which grows a bit, and the other is Linux. And everything else, so the classic mainframe, the classic Unix, and all the other options are in decline. So I think that proves how safe of a choice Linux and open source has become these days. But Linux is just one example. What we're seeing now is a trend. Cloud is not me. Cloud is a big topic these days. And there is an open source project called OpenStack that was created only 2-3 years ago in 2010. And already now we are seeing, and I'm sure other companies or other organizations are seeing a very strong interest from users and customers to move into that direction. And if you look at all the companies that are involved, the hardware vendors, the software vendors, network providers, etc., you see that OpenStack really is going to become the Linux of clouds. There's a lot of industry support. There's also a community that's very vibrant, and last year an OpenStack Foundation was created. And that's also an important point to note. Open source or free software has many aspects and can be defined in different ways. What's really key in my personal experience is that you always need a combination. You need a combination of an independent project that is not controlled by one company or by just one organization. You need a community of volunteers, like I do in my spare time, and probably several of you are doing. And you also need companies who are interested and engaged. And if you have those aspects, if you have the commercial interest, if you have the communities, and have that in a somewhat independent manner, like we have the Linux kernel and the Linux Foundation or OpenStack, then that is a recipe for success. Because open source is not only about just the license. It's really about communities and how we work together. And one thing we have done, for example, as SUSE, perhaps it's my cell phone, is a free service. So it's free software, and we provide a service called the Open Build Service, where you can build all sorts of open source packages yourself, whatever you want to do. You can build it, you can consume what others have built for many different free and open source operating systems. And there is another project called GitHub, and that's where you find many open source projects. And so the reason I'm pointing out those two examples is that when we talk open source, I have two recommendations that I would make. Number one, give it a try in your environment or on your notebook or in your company or in your organization, because it's good to use, it's safe to use. And number two, depending on what your needs are, engage. So engage with the communities, invite community members, engage with vendors, hire open source developers in your organization, possibly allow people in your organization to contribute to open source. In my personal experience, in the experience we have made as SUSE as a company, if you do that, if you give it a try, if you rely on open source, And if you also contribute, if you become part to some extent of that environment, that's a recipe for success. Спасибо.